Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my series on institutionalized racism here in the United States of America. This week I want to focus on the question of, was the founding of the United States based on racism? And one reason I want to address that question is because it's a topic that's kind of come up a lot with the controversy surrounding the 1619 Project, and more recently with the controversy surrounding critical race theory. So before I get into this question about was the United States founded on racism, let me just reiterate something I've said in a video before. I made a whole video about this, about what critical race theory is and isn't. Critical race theory is not a theory that reinterprets history. It is not. It is a legal study which examines the law to see, essentially, what impact the law has on people from different races, and are laws being written in ways which work against members of certain races, particularly African Americans. The reason why it's called critical race theory is because it theorizes that writing laws a certain way or will either benefit or hurt members of minority races here in the United States of America, and focusing on African Americans. It is not a theory of history. It is based on history. Critical race theory is based on history. Critical race theory is not rewriting history. The history that critical race theory is based on is not in dispute. It is not in dispute. But critical race theory is not an attempt to revise American history. It is based on things that we understand now about American history. It is based on a truer knowledge of American history. And that's really important to understand, I think, before moving forward. Because what I'm going to tell you isn't critical race theory. What I'm going to tell you is American history. And that's really important. So the question of whether or not the United States was founded on racism depends on whether or not you think intent matters. So, in terms of intent, was the United States founded on racism? I know a lot of people here want to jump in and say, no, the United States was founded for religious freedom, because throughout most of our, here in the United States of America's public school education, we were told that the original colonists who came to the United States came here seeking the freedom to practice their religion however they wanted to, that it was about freedom, and particularly religious freedom. This is one of those yes and no questions. An important thing to keep in mind is that there were 13 original American colonies, or eventually there were 13 original American colonies, and they were not all founded for religious freedom, and nor were they all founded for the same religious freedom. People like to talk about the Pilgrims and how the Pilgrims got on board the Mayflower and came here to establish, a colony based on their beliefs. A couple of problems wrong with that. Number one, the Pilgrims were actually kind of recruited employees of a company called the Virginia Company of Plymouth, and about half the passengers on the Mayflower weren't Puritans, weren't seeking religious freedom. They were searching for land and economic opportunity. The real religious colony that came along after that was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was in fact founded based on Puritan religious beliefs. But what a lot of people overlook, or seem to kind of meld together in their minds, is the first successful, meaning it lasted, English colony in North America was Jamestown, which was founded in 1607 and founded 13 years before the Mayflower arrived off the coast of North America and the Plymouth colony was established. That 13 years is important. So, I think it's safe to say that most of the people who got on board the ships and came from England or other places to what became the English colonies in North America didn't say, hey, let's go found a racist society. That didn't mean they didn't take racist ideas with them. Look at there is racism in the very assumption that these people could just go to North America and get land. The assumption is that that land is there for the taking. Now, you and I both know that there were people already here. That the people who we can call First Nations or Indigenous Americans or Native Americans were already here. They already had sophisticated cultures and, eons old cultures and traditions and religious beliefs. They occupied the land, they worked the land, they benefited from the land, and they had their own society. It was not, open space. But notice that the English colonists essentially treated it as though it were. As though the land was here for the taking. Well, that kind of indicates at its very heart that the English colonists that came to North America did not believe that Native Americans, that Indigenous Americans were equal. They believed them to be savages and barbarians with backward culture, and therefore they weren't worthy of the land, and that God, with the Puritans or with half the Mayflower people or whatever, that God intended for white Europeans to settle and benefit from the land. That is an inherently racist idea. So I wouldn't say that the intent of the people found in colonies was to establish a racist society, but they certainly brought with them very racist ideas, and those very racist ideas, in lots of ways, really had an obviously negative, detrimental impact on the Native American indigenous population here. You know, even before the English colonies in North America were founded, Native Americans living along the Atlantic coast of what's now the United States had already had lots of contact with European fishermen who stopped in and stopped along the coast at various points in time to trade and get water and to get food. These were mostly fishing vessels that were already fishing off the coast of North America. And those people had already introduced devastating diseases to the native populations of North America. So the native population of North America, the indigenous population of North America, was already dying off before the Jamestown colonists arrived, before the Mayflower colonists arrived and established Plymouth. That process was already taking place. And so was an indication of how English colonists would treat Native Americans. And this is best exemplified, I think, by one of the more famous Native Americans, one of the more famous indigenous people from this time period, and his name was Tisquantum. In American history for a long time he was called Squanto. Tisquantum was a member of a tribe who lived on the coast of what is today Massachusetts, and he was actually kidnapped and enslaved by a European ship captain, and he was sold into slavery in Spain. He made his way to England, and from England he made it back to the Americas and back to the area where he was actually from, only to find that the place which had been the summer location of his village, of his indigenous group's village, was now occupied by, guess who? The Mayflower colonists. What had happened to Tisquantum's people? They'd all died from disease, which had been introduced by European fishermen. And how was Tisquantum treated by the English? He was treated as an inferior, he was enslaved, he was sold for profit. That indicates there are quite a few racist ideas that already existed even before, in terms of the English and their treatment of Native Americans, even before the colonies themselves were established. So every English colony was established on the assumption that the land was open, it was theirs for the taking, that Native Americans didn't deserve the land, and every single English colony then treated Native Americans in that way. In the Jamestown colony, you know, Captain John Smith is more or less the reason why the Jamestown colony survived, and his attitude towards the Native Americans was essentially to use them, to enslave them, to make them do the work so the English colonists didn't have to. And if he could achieve that through negotiation, then that's what he did. If he had to achieve that through war, then that's what he did. I believe the Powhatan War takes place in 1609 or 1610, and after that the English colonists were able to kind of subdue and take advantage of the Native American population, the indigenous population in Virginia. By 1636, the English colonists in the Massachusetts area, both the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony, were having trouble with a specific group of Native Americans or indigenous people called the Pequots, and the Pequot War broke out, and the Pequot War was a war of extermination. If you look at William Bradford's writing about the Pequots and the view of the Puritans about the Pequots, they actually treated them as even a lesser group of people than other indigenous people, and they fought a war to exterminate them, and they were relatively successful. If we look at North Carolina, in North Carolina, the Tuscaroras were essentially exterminated. In South Carolina, the Yamasee Native Americans were essentially exterminated by colonists. Now, oftentimes the colonists used other Native American groups to help them fight wars against Native American groups, and then they just turned right around on their former Native American allies. So what we see then is that all the colonies that were established by England fight genocidal wars. Genocidal wars against Native American groups who stand in their way. And they literally just viewed Native Americans as an obstacle. They literally just viewed Native Americans as something to be gotten out of the way so that they could be successful. They're therefore not really viewing them as humans. By the way, they also enslaved Native Americans, going back to the story of Tisquantum, that they enslaved Native Americans, they captured them, they oftentimes sold them to slavery away in the Caribbean, to the Caribbean colonies where life expectancy was much shorter, and whole groups of Native Americans, indigenous people, just essentially disappeared. After that, in addition to all those things, in addition to the disease and the war, English colonists introduced indigenous people to alcohol, which created real problems in helping to destroy Native American society and culture and creating real dependency. They introduced the idea of, we think about the American colonists engaging in trade with Native Americans, and certainly did, but they engaged in a kind of a trade system which really did not work to the advantage of Native Americans. In the beginning, Native Americans might get tools, they might get weapons, they might get manufactured goods, and in return they paid in animal furs. Well, eventually, as those animals began to be hunted closer to points of extinction, Native Americans who were involved in trade with American colonists had to go further and further. This leads to more tension between Native American groups, and it creates kind of a system of debt peonage, which the colonists were more than happy to take advantage of, where essentially, Native Americans owed them so much money for the trade goods they gave them that they had to work essentially for free, and that happens in all the colonies as well. So then, in addition to that, we know, thanks to the 1619 Project in American history, that the first real group of enslaved Africans reached the shores of the English colonies in North America in 1619 near Jamestown, and they arrived here and were sold to landowners in Virginia, and they arrived a year before the Mayflower colonists arrived in Plymouth. So their contributions, their work, their presence in North America goes back even further. I don't think anybody would argue that slavery was not an example of a law and a system set up for racist reasons and set up based on racist principles. So I know a lot of the stuff that I've said here is something you may already know, and I know a lot of times, in part because of the way in which we're taught American history, that these things become kind of ingrained as, an inevitability. That yes, these things were bad, but, inevitably the United States had to come into existence, so all these things, bad things had to happen so we could have the society that we live in today. I just want you to take a moment and notice how much of a settler colonist attitude that is. Who benefits from the United States being the way it is today? Indigenous peoples, Native Americans? African Americans? Who benefits most from the United States society that we created by destroying Native American society and enslaving African Americans? Right. The settler colonist descendants themselves are the people who benefit from that the most, and therefore they're the ones most likely to try to defend it. Defend it from anything which makes them feel like, they're not as special as American history makes them feel. It is an inherently privileged position to believe that we are entitled to be proud of our history. That we are entitled to be proud of our history. That we should not have to confront the reality of our history because of how great we are today, if we're great, of how great we are today. That is an entitled position, and a position that members who are not descended from these settler colonial groups really don't have a reason to support and don't have a reason to believe in. So a couple of things about this kind of settler colonist mindset and clues you can think of in your own head of how these things have worked their way maybe into your own thinking. So if you think a European discovered the Americas, you are thinking from the settler colonial point of view. It doesn't matter if you think it was Christopher Columbus or Leif Erikson or somebody else. If you think the Americas were discovered by a European, then you are thinking from a settler colonist mindset. You are assuming that what was here before is less than what was brought. That this discovery is beneficial, is a good thing. And it's a good thing for settler colonists and their descendants, not for the people that they exterminated and enslaved. If you think that what happened to Native Americans and African Americans in terms of loss of land, destruction of culture, genocide, enslavement, for hundreds of years, if you think all those things were unfortunate, consequences of building up to, create a great American society, then you are thinking like a settler colonist. You are only seeing things from the point of view of those who won. That these things might be bad, and we might say, okay, yes, that's all bad, but that had to happen so we could have what we have now. Well, that is you assuming that what you have now is better and is much more important than anything else which might have come from those groups of people. That's also true. If you think that slavery is the same as indentured servitude, you are intentionally ignoring several things about indentured servitude. Were indentured servants treated badly? Often, but here are three really important things that make the indentured servitude different from slavery. Four important things that make indentured servitude different from slavery. Indentured servants entered into their servitude voluntarily. They actually signed a contract. B, that contract dictated how they had to be treated, how they had to be fed, how they had to be clothed, and how long their term of indenture was. And 3, the indentured servitude was not permanent. You were going to end up being free. And 4, your kids, your children would not be enslaved simply because you had been an indentured servant. That really separates it from slavery. So don't come back and say, well, there were a lot of white people who were indentured servants and that's like slaves. That's not the same thing at all. Slavery in the United States was permanent, it was hereditary, and it was based on race. Okay? Indentured servitude was not. Not to mention the fact that eventually indentured servitude went away in the United States, in the American colonies, because it was just too expensive. In those places where labor was most necessary, like in tobacco farming colonies of the Chesapeake Bay region in the South, or the rice farming colony of South Carolina, indentured servitude went away really fast because it was more expensive than slavery. For economic reasons, indentured servitude came to an end, and for economic reasons, slavery stayed. And then finally, if you think that because African Americans who were brought to the United States against their will and forced to work as slaves, if you think that means their contribution doesn't count, I'm sorry to tell you that is an inherently settler, colonist, racist point of view. To disqualify their labor, disqualify the things they did, simply because they were forced to do them. Notice, if they didn't do them, they wouldn't get done. And if those people hadn't done them, we wouldn't have a United States of America, whether you think that's a good thing or not. Anyway, so there you go. Just wanted to address this issue of was the United States founded on racism, and the answer is yes. Anyway, look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thanks for watching.